We live in a world where we are globalizing at a fast pace. And in that, for those of us who live in the West, we're used to framing everything in terms of everything political and cultural, in terms of left and right. And to be quite honest with you, there are things that simply don't fit in there, because that framework of left and right and middle, it is not non-Western, it's only Western. So if you're grappling with the issue of political Islam, jihadism, da'wah, that sort of thing, it just doesn't fit in there. And what happens as a side effect, and maybe intended by the far left, maybe intended by the far right, I don't know. But once you try to squeeze this big global civilizational issue into that very narrow framework of left and right, you are then left with the left calling everyone a racist that don't agree with them. And the right expressing themselves, the far right expressing themselves only in nationalistic terms. And as they continue to do that, as they continue to eat one another, hate one another, this big, enormous tsunami of problems is coming at us. Now, you look at incidents like the one on New Year's Eve in Cologne, Germany, and other German cities, but also in Scandinavia, and in this country also, it has been going on for a long time. Little girls, as young as 10 years, have been subjected to rape, were abused, and that is racist, by men who formed gangs who would only prey on white little girls. I don't think they were doing this as a matter of religion. It wasn't their religion, but they were doing it because they come from a culture where women mean nothing, they're chattel. And as this is going on, if the police and the politicians and the social workers, the people who are supposed to protect these young people, we pay taxes so that we can be protected. If they sweep this under the rug, then are we not empowering the regressive left, the far right, and the radical Islamists? And we're not doing this only in the UK. We're doing it all over Europe, and we're doing it in the United States. And yes, once in a while, someone like a Donald Trump pops up and starts to repeat a sentiment that is very angry coming from the population. And if we want to have an intelligent conversation, but all the process, all this time that we could have had this intelligent conversation, we close the doors to that.
Yeah. So when you speak in these terms, I think often people worry that you're generalizing, but actually I'd argue that currently, and the snapshot of time that we can survey at the moment, the statistics demonstrate a worrying trend, a very worrying trend. And what I've often said is that whereas Islamism, that I would define as the desire to impose a version of Islam over society, theocracy, Islamism needs to be intellectually terminated. Islam today, as the religion, requires reform.
Yeah, so the way I see it, it's two different projects. One project is within the House of Islam, and I'm aware from your writings that you don't like the use of the term the House of Islam. Yeah. But this is what the radicals and the Islamists use. They conceive of a House of Islam. They conceive of the inhabitants of that House of Islam as the Ummah, and they want to unite the Ummah to gain this utopian state called the Caliphate. So what happens inside the House of Islam and the project of reformation, that is one project, one subject. The other is what happens in free societies and how they're affected by the Islamists. So when I talk about the rule of law, when I talk about the equality between men and women, gays, fighting anti-Semitism, fighting for the basic principles of democracy and the rule of law, that is a different. I feel as if, yes, there's a very good chance, and I see it much better than I did 5 or 6 years ago, that the House of Islam might be reformed, because there's a group of people like you who are coming out and who are asking very basic questions and who hope through critical thinking to reform as in change, as in modify the basic tenets of Islam, and to minimize and maybe marginalize the Medina Muslims, those with an agenda who want to impose Sharia law.
Yeah.
So that's one project, and that is what my last book was about. And then there is how do we preserve our own rights and freedoms and not descend into chaos. So if you take the two together, you would say, leaving aside political correctness, leaving aside the fringes, that we have an interest in supporting the modifiers. So in my book, I do not use the terms radical versus moderate, extreme versus moderate. I prefer, if you read and listen and focus on what the Islamists are telling you, they make this reference, and it's constant, to the Prophet Muhammad and trying to emulate him in the Quran. So if you take the Prophet Muhammad, you see that in the beginning when he was in Mecca, he was preaching. And what he was preaching is what we would define as religion now. When he goes to Medina, he starts to do other things. He starts to wage wars, he legislates, he is judge, jury, general, all at the same time. Now, the people who are Muslim, 1/5 of humanity, who emphasize, when they invoke the Prophet Muhammad, if they emphasize the Mecca period, I label them the Mecca Muslims. The others who invoke Muhammad and emphasize the Medina period and actively set out to Islamize the world through da'wah or mission work or jihad or a combination, I label them the Medina Muslims in that book. And then there's this third group, of which I think you are a member, who want to modify and change. And the enemy are the Medina Muslims. So in this confrontation between the Medina Muslims on the one hand and the modifying Muslims on the other, I think it is in our interest as free societies to side with the modifiers, to empower the modifiers, to expose the agenda of the Medina Muslims in pretty much the way we challenged the ideas of communism, the ideas of National Socialism, because these Medina Muslims promise a utopia that on paper may be appealing to those who are born into Islam, but in reality looks like what ISIS is performing.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.